Adolf Hitler's transformation from a failed artist to Germany's dictator began in the devastation of World War I. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler served as a messenger in the German army and was temporarily blinded by gas attacks. Germany's defeat in 1918 left him, like millions of Germans, feeling humiliated and betrayed. The Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations on Germany, creating economic chaos and national resentment. Hyperinflation destroyed savings, unemployment soared, and political extremism flourished. In this environment, Hitler discovered his greatest talent: public speaking that could electrify crowds with promises of national renewal. In 1919, Hitler joined the tiny German Workers' Party in Munich, later renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. His fiery speeches blamed Germany's problems on Jews, communists, and the democratic government. The failed beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923 should have ended his career, but Hitler used his trial as a platform to spread his message nationwide. During his brief imprisonment, Hitler wrote Mein Kampf, outlining his racist ideology and plans for German expansion. The book combined extreme nationalism with anti-Semitism, presenting a vision of German racial superiority that would justify future atrocities. Upon release, Hitler rebuilt the Nazi Party with himself as absolute leader. The Great Depression of 1929 created Hitler's opportunity. As unemployment reached 6 million, desperate Germans turned to extremist solutions. The Nazis skillfully exploited economic fear, promising jobs, national pride, and simple explanations for complex problems. Their brown-shirted stormtroopers intimidated opponents while projecting strength and order. By 1932, the Nazi Party had become Germany's largest political party, though Hitler lost the presidential election to Paul von Hindenburg. However, conservative politicians believed they could control and use Hitler for their own purposes. This fatal miscalculation led to Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30, 1933. Within weeks, Hitler began dismantling German democracy. The Reichstag fire provided the pretext to suspend civil liberties and arrest political opponents. The Enabling Act gave Hitler dictatorial powers, legally ending parliamentary democracy. Conservative politicians who thought they could manipulate Hitler discovered too late that they had unleashed forces beyond their control. The Weimar Republic died not through revolution, but through the democratic process itself, as voters chose authoritarianism over democracy. Hitler's rise demonstrated how economic crisis, political polarization, and the failure of democratic institutions could destroy even a modern, educated society. Once appointed Chancellor, Hitler moved with ruthless efficiency to transform Germany into a totalitarian state. The process, called Gleichschaltung or coordination, systematically eliminated all independent institutions and brought every aspect of German life under Nazi control. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, provided the perfect pretext for repression. Hitler blamed communists for the arson and convinced President Hindenburg to suspend constitutional rights. Thousands of communists, socialists, and other opponents were arrested. The atmosphere of crisis allowed the Nazis to present themselves as Germany's saviors from chaos. The Enabling Act, passed under intimidation in March 1933, gave Hitler the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval. This legal coup effectively ended German democracy. Trade unions were abolished on May 1, 1933, and replaced with Nazi-controlled organizations. By July, all political parties except the Nazis were banned, making Germany a one-party state. Hitler's most dramatic consolidation move came during the Night of the Long Knives on June 30, 1934. The SA stormtroopers, led by Ernst Röhm, had become a liability, too radical and independent for Hitler's purposes. In a brutal purge, Hitler ordered the murder of Röhm and hundreds of other potential rivals, including conservatives who had opposed him. This massacre demonstrated that even Nazis were not safe from Hitler's paranoia. When President Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler combined the offices of Chancellor and President, becoming the Führer, absolute leader of Germany. The army swore a personal oath of loyalty to Hitler, not to Germany or its constitution. This oath would later be used to justify following criminal orders. The Nazi regime's racial ideology began implementation through the Nuremberg Laws of September 1935. These laws stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriages between Jews and non-Jewish Germans. Jews were systematically excluded from civil service, universities, and professions. These legal restrictions marked the beginning of a process that would culminate in genocide. Joseph Goebbels, the Reich Minister of Propaganda, created a massive apparatus to control information and shape public opinion. Nazi ideology was promoted through rallies, films, radio broadcasts, and mass events designed to create emotional unity around the Führer. The regime understood that controlling minds was as important as controlling bodies. By 1935, Hitler had achieved what seemed impossible just 2 years earlier: the complete transformation of a democratic society into a dictatorship, accomplished largely through legal means and popular support. Between 1935 and 1939, Nazi Germany underwent radical transformation as Hitler prepared for war while implementing his vision of a racially pure society. The regime's economic policies, while creating short-term prosperity, were designed primarily to serve military expansion rather than civilian welfare. Massive public works projects, including the construction of the Autobahn highway system, reduced unemployment and boosted Nazi popularity. However, these programs were funded by deficit spending and forced labor, creating an unsustainable economic bubble. The regime's ultimate goal was rearmament, rebuilding Germany's military strength in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The persecution of Jews intensified dramatically during this period. The 1935 Nuremberg Laws were expanded with hundreds of additional regulations restricting Jewish life. Jews were banned from parks, swimming pools, theaters, and restaurants. Professional licenses were revoked, and Jewish businesses were boycotted and eventually confiscated. The regime's goal was to make Jewish life in Germany impossible. The persecution extended beyond Jews to include Roma, disabled individuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. The T4 euthanasia program began secretly murdering disabled individuals, justified by Nazi theories about racial hygiene and the cost of caring for unproductive members of society. These murders served as a testing ground for later mass killing methods. Hitler's foreign policy became increasingly aggressive as Germany rearmed. In 1936, German troops reoccupied the Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles. The weak international response encouraged further aggression. Germany formed the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini's Italy and signed the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan, creating a global alliance of fascist powers. The Spanish Civil War provided Germany with an opportunity to test new military equipment and tactics. The bombing of Guernica by German aircraft shocked the world and demonstrated the destructive potential of modern warfare. German support helped Franco's fascist forces win the war, creating another authoritarian ally. In 1938, Hitler achieved the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, without firing a shot. Austrian Nazis had prepared the ground, and many Austrians welcomed unification with Germany. The Munich Agreement later that year gave Hitler the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, as Britain and France chose appeasement over confrontation. However, when Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, it became clear that appeasement had failed. Hitler's appetite for conquest was insatiable, and war was inevitable. The Nazi regime had successfully transformed Germany into a militaristic, racist state ready for aggressive expansion. World War II erupted on September 1, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland using revolutionary blitzkrieg tactics that combined tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry in coordinated attacks. Polish forces, still relying on cavalry and outdated tactics, were overwhelmed within weeks. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but failed to provide meaningful assistance to their Polish ally. The German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, signed just days before the invasion, shocked the world by uniting Nazi Germany and Communist Russia in a temporary alliance. This pact included secret protocols dividing Poland between the two powers, ensuring Germany could fight a one-front war initially. The winter of 1939 to 1940, dubbed the Phony War, saw little fighting on the Western Front as both sides prepared for the real conflict. However, Germany was actively planning its next moves. The invasion of Denmark and Norway in April 1940 secured strategic positions and vital iron ore supplies from Sweden. The real shock came in May 1940 with the German offensive against Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. German forces bypassed the heavily fortified Maginot Line by attacking through the supposedly impassable Ardennes forest. This brilliant tactical maneuver caught French forces completely off guard and led to the rapid collapse of Western European resistance. The fall of France in June 1940 left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. The evacuation of British forces from Dunkirk, while a tactical defeat, became a symbol of British determination to continue fighting. Winston Churchill's leadership inspired British resistance with his famous declaration that Britain would never surrender. The Battle of Britain, 1940 to 1941, marked Hitler's first major setback. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, launched sustained bombing campaigns against British airfields and cities, but failed to achieve air superiority. RAF pilots, supported by radar technology and intelligence breakthroughs, inflicted heavy losses on German aircraft. Frustrated by his inability to defeat Britain, Hitler made the fateful decision to attack the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest military operation in history, involving over 3 million German troops. This decision opened the two-front war that Hitler had sought to avoid. Initial German success on the Eastern Front was spectacular, with millions of Soviet soldiers captured or killed. However, the vast distances, harsh weather, and fierce Soviet resistance gradually slowed the German advance, setting the stage for eventual defeat. The Holocaust represents the Nazi regime's most horrific crime: the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others in an industrialized program of genocide unprecedented in human history. What began as discrimination and persecution evolved into state-sponsored mass murder on an unimaginable scale. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a crucial escalation in Nazi racial policy. Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, followed German armies eastward, conducting mass shootings of Jews, communist officials, and intellectuals. These units murdered over 1 million people in the first year of the Eastern Campaign, often with the cooperation of local collaborators. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 coordinated the final solution to the Jewish question: the Nazi plan to murder all European Jews. Senior Nazi officials discussed logistics, transportation, and methods for implementing continent-wide genocide. The conference's bureaucratic tone masked the enormous evil being planned. Death camps were constructed across occupied Poland, including Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec. These facilities were designed solely for mass murder, using gas chambers disguised as shower rooms to kill thousands of people daily. The selection process upon arrival determined who would be murdered immediately and who would be worked to death as slave laborers. Jews were transported to these camps in overcrowded cattle cars from ghettos across Nazi-occupied Europe. Families were torn apart within hours of arrival, often never seeing each other again. The dehumanizing process began with the confiscation of belongings, the shaving of heads, and the replacement of names with numbers tattooed on arms. The Holocaust extended beyond Jews to include Roma, disabled individuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and political prisoners. The T4 euthanasia program had already murdered over 70,000 disabled individuals, providing experience and personnel for later mass killing operations. Medical experiments were conducted on prisoners by Nazi doctors who abandoned all ethical principles. Victims were subjected to freezing, sterilization, and other tortures disguised as research. Even in death, victims were exploited as their hair was used for textiles and gold teeth were extracted. The scale and systematic nature of these crimes represented an unprecedented level of organized evil. Entire communities were wiped out, and centuries of Jewish life in Europe were destroyed. By war's end, 2/3 of European Jewry had been murdered. The Holocaust demonstrated how modern state machinery could be used for genocide, creating legal and moral frameworks that continue to influence international law and human rights protection today. The character of World War II changed dramatically when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, bringing the United States into the conflict. Hitler's subsequent declaration of war on America proved to be a strategic disaster, as it brought the world's greatest industrial power fully into the European theater. On the Eastern Front, initial German success began to falter as Soviet resistance stiffened and winter arrived. The siege of Leningrad became an 872-day ordeal of unimaginable suffering, with over 1 million civilians dying from starvation and disease. Yet the city never fell, becoming a symbol of Soviet determination. The Battle of Moscow in winter 1941 to 1942 marked the first major German defeat. German forces reached the capital's suburbs but were ill-equipped for Russian winter conditions. Soviet counterattacks, led by General Zhukov and supported by Siberian troops accustomed to extreme cold, pushed German forces back from the city. Germany's 1942 summer offensive aimed to capture the Caucasus oil fields and the city of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad became the war's turning point, as German forces became bogged down in brutal urban warfare. Soviet forces gradually encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping over 200,000 troops in the ruined city. In North Africa, German forces under Erwin Rommel initially achieved remarkable success, earning him the nickname Desert Fox. However, the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942 marked the beginning of Axis retreat. The subsequent Allied invasion of Sicily and Italy in 1943 opened another front and led to Mussolini's overthrow. The war's industrial dimension became increasingly important. Germany's economy, despite early advantages from conquered territories, could not match the combined production capacity of the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain. The Allies' ability to outproduce Germany in tanks, aircraft, ships, and ammunition became decisive. German society felt the war's impact as never before. Rationing intensified, major cities faced increasing Allied bombing, and millions of German men were fighting on multiple fronts. The Nazi regime's early promises of quick victory were replaced by calls for total war and sacrifice. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, though Nazi ideology had previously emphasized their role as mothers and homemakers. The regime's racial policies created labor shortages filled by millions of foreign workers, many working under slave-like conditions. By 1943, it was becoming clear that Germany could not win a prolonged war against the Allied coalition's superior resources and manpower. The year 1943 marked the definitive turning point of World War II, with Germany suffering decisive defeats on multiple fronts that shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. The German surrender at Stalingrad in February, with over 200,000 casualties, shocked the German public and marked the beginning of continuous retreat on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 represented Germany's last major offensive operation in the East. Hitler concentrated his remaining reserves for Operation Citadel, hoping to destroy Soviet forces in a massive pincer movement. However, Soviet intelligence had learned of the attack, and the Red Army was prepared with deep defensive positions and massive tank reserves. The failure at Kursk cost Germany irreplaceable men and equipment. From this point forward, German forces in the east would fight a desperate defensive war against an increasingly powerful Soviet military. The Red Army, now better equipped and experienced, began its inexorable advance westward, liberating Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The Allied bombing campaign intensified dramatically during this period. The destruction of Hamburg in July 1943 created a firestorm that killed over 40,000 civilians, demonstrating the growing effectiveness of strategic bombing. German cities were systematically targeted, destroying industrial capacity and civilian morale, while forcing Germany to divert resources to air defense. The Allies achieved air superiority over Europe, making German military operations increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages grounded many German aircraft, while Allied bombers ranged freely over German territory. The bombing campaign also disrupted transportation networks, hampering German military logistics. D-Day on June 6, 1944, opened the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy, establishing a foothold that would grow into a massive invasion force. Despite fierce German resistance, the Allies successfully broke out of the beachhead and began their advance across France. The assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, by German officers led by Claus von Stauffenberg, demonstrated growing opposition within the military establishment. The plot's failure led to brutal purges of the German officer corps, with over 5,000 people executed. This internal resistance revealed the regime's increasing fragility. As 1944 progressed, Germany's military situation became hopeless. The Allies liberated Paris in August and pushed toward Germany's borders. In the east, Soviet forces reached the Baltic Sea, cutting off German Army Group North and advancing toward Poland. The Nazi regime's control over occupied territories crumbled as resistance movements grew stronger and liberation appeared imminent. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 represented Germany's last major offensive. Hitler gambled his remaining reserves in a desperate attempt to split the Allied forces and recapture the port of Antwerp. The initial surprise attack achieved some success, but American forces held key positions at Bastogne and other strongpoints. The offensive's failure cost Germany its last strategic reserves. Soviet forces launched their final offensive in January 1945, advancing across Poland with overwhelming force. The Red Army, now vastly superior in men and equipment, swept aside German resistance and advanced toward the Reich's borders. The liberation of concentration camps revealed the full horror of Nazi crimes to the world. The discovery of Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps shocked even hardened soldiers. The systematic murder of millions could no longer be hidden or denied. These revelations strengthened Allied resolve to achieve Germany's complete defeat and hold Nazi leaders accountable for their crimes. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, German resistance began to crumble. Cities fell in rapid succession, and millions of German civilians fled westward to escape Soviet forces. The Nazi regime's control over its own territory disintegrated as local officials abandoned their posts. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Berlin bunker, refused to surrender and issued Nero orders for Germany's complete destruction, rather than allow it to fall into Allied hands. These orders to destroy infrastructure, factories, and food supplies were largely ignored by German commanders who recognized that the war was lost. The final battle for Berlin began on April 16, 1945. Soviet forces surrounded the city and fought their way through fierce resistance from Hitler Youth, SS units, and desperate soldiers. As shells fell around his bunker, Hitler married his longtime companion Eva Braun on April 29th. On April 30th, 1945, as Soviet forces approached his bunker, Hitler committed suicide. Admiral Dönitz briefly succeeded him, but the regime's end was inevitable. On May 7th, German military leaders signed the unconditional surrender at Rheims, France. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, had lasted just 12 years and ended in total defeat and devastation. The defeat of Nazi Germany marked the end of the deadliest conflict in human history. But its consequences continue to shape international relations, legal systems, and moral understanding today. The immediate aftermath saw Germany divided among the victorious Allies, with the country eventually split into democratic West Germany and communist East Germany. The Nuremberg trials, 1945 to 1949, established crucial precedents for international justice. Nazi leaders were prosecuted for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, a new legal concept that recognized certain acts as so heinous they concerned all humanity. The trials documented the regime's crimes and established that following orders was not a valid defense for war crimes. The revelation of the Holocaust shocked the world and led to fundamental changes in international law and human rights. The United Nations was established in 1945, partly to prevent future genocides. The State of Israel was created in 1948 as a homeland for Jewish survivors, fulfilling the Zionist dream born from centuries of persecution. Germany underwent extensive denazification programs designed to remove Nazi influence from society. Though these efforts had mixed success, the country was rebuilt with democratic institutions, constitutional protections for human rights, and a commitment to peaceful international relations. The eventual reunification in 1990 completed Germany's transformation from Nazi dictatorship to stable democracy. The Cold War that followed World War II was partly shaped by the Nazi experience. The division of Europe and the nuclear arms race reflected the Allies' inability to maintain their wartime cooperation. The memory of Nazi aggression influenced the creation of NATO and other international security organizations. Modern Germany has confronted its past more thoroughly than perhaps any other nation. Holocaust education is mandatory in schools, and the country has paid substantial reparations to survivors and their descendants. Memorial sites preserve the memory of Nazi crimes, and Holocaust denial is a criminal offense. The study of the Nazi period has provided crucial insights into the fragility of democratic institutions and the dangers of authoritarianism. Scholars have identified warning signs of democratic breakdown, including the polarization of politics, the erosion of democratic norms, and the scapegoating of minority groups. The phrase "never again" became a rallying cry for preventing future genocides, though subsequent history in Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, and elsewhere has shown the difficulty of fulfilling this promise. The Nazi experience remains a permanent warning about the consequences of hatred, the importance of protecting minority rights, and the responsibility of individuals to resist evil even when sanctioned by authority. Understanding this history remains essential for protecting democracy and human dignity in the modern world.